So, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Gäste und Freunde der Berliner Korrespondenzen, ich heiße Sie sehr herzlich willkommen. Ich bin Jan-Henrik Olbers, einer der 3 Kuratoren, gemeinsam mit Esra Küçük und Andreas Görgen, der heute leider verhindert ist. Wir fahren fort in unserer Reihe Berliner Korrespondenzen, in der es im Wesentlichen um Ordnungen geht, also schon irgendwie eine Metapher, die uns beschäftigt, übrigens schon seit dem Jahresbeginn 2016. Ich habe noch mal geguckt, meine erste Datei in diesem Zusammenhang datiert vom 1. Februar 2016, als die Überlegung aufkam, angeregt durch Frank-Walter Steinmeier, der dann am 22. April auch die erste Veranstaltung hier eröffnet hat, der irgendwie unzufrieden damit war, dass er als damaliger Bundesaußenminister durch die Weltgeschichte fuhr und von Krisenherd zu Krisenherd und Schlichten und Kontrahenten an einen Tisch zu bringen versuchte, aber viel lieber noch hinter die Hintergründe von Konflikten historischer, kultureller Art, die auf der Welt herrschen, zu kommen. Und da wurde die Idee geboren, ob man nicht Wissenschaft und Kunst an einen Tisch bekommt, die Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, das Auswärtige Amt und das Gorki-Theater. Und das Gorki-Theater ist ja nun bekannt dafür, dass es sich an Ordnung reibt. Das sieht man schon an dem R, was spiegelschriftlich im Namen Gorki steckt. Also die Idee, die Ordnung auch zu irritieren und zu hinterfragen, ist damit eine Art Leitmotiv von uns geworden. Und anknüpfen können wir hier in diesem Haus an eine tolle Tradition, denn in den ersten beiden Jahrzehnten des 19. Jahrhunderts war dies ein Ort öffentlicher Vorträge, Aufklärung für das Bürgertum, aber eben vom Handwerksmeister bis König Wilhelm III., die hier den Vorträgen, etwa den Kosmos-Vorlesungen von Alexander von Humboldt gelauscht haben. Ein bisschen knüpfen wir darauf an, vielleicht mit etwas übersteigertem Selbstbewusstsein, aber auch schon damals ging es mehr oder weniger um das Thema Ordnung, was wir auch behandeln wollen, durchaus im Hamletschen Sinne, in der Überlegung oder Sorge, die Welt könnte aus den Fugen sein, wobei wir nicht nur nach der Welt fragen, sondern auch nach den Fugen, das heißt also nach den sich ändernden Maßstäben, nach denen wir Ordnung und Unordnung versuchen zu beurteilen. Und heute geht es nun um Digitalisierung. Bevor wir aber damit beginnen, möchte ich Sie darauf aufmerksam machen, dass wir es inzwischen geschafft haben, muss man fast schon sagen, in enger Zusammenarbeit mit dem Nicolai Verlag 6 solcher kleiner Broschüren herauszugeben, in denen auf Deutsch und Englisch der bisherige Verlauf unserer Korrespondenzen mit ein paar Ausnahmen, die aber nachgereicht werden, so ist es, Esra, ne? Inzwischen käuflich zu erwerben sind. Die kann man übrigens so rumdrehen und die kann man so rumdrehen, auf Deutsch und auf Englisch lesen. Und da unter anderem Herr Fratscher und Herr Borgolte da sind, die ich herzlich begrüße, die nämlich Mitautoren und Mitreferenten waren, wollte ich ein bisschen Werbung machen. Diese Broschüren, die sowohl die Vorträge als auch den Diskussionsverlauf, zumindest in ausgewählten spannenden Passagen dokumentieren, können Sie nachher im Foyer, wenn Sie das möchten, auch anschauen oder erwerben. Ja, heute haben wir als Gäste eingeladen Evgeny Morozov und Lorena Jaume-Palasí, die über Digitalisierung reden werden. Vorgestellt werden sie durch unsere Moderatorin ROMY KRÄMER, die ich auch sehr herzlich willkommen heiße. Und ich will nur mit ganz wenigen Gedanken in das Thema einführen, weil es mich selbst auch ziemlich berührt, unter anderem in der akademischen Lehre, weil dort auch die Frage im Raume schwebt und fast so ein bisschen vibriert, ob uns die Digitalisierung, die ja alle unsere Lebensbereiche inzwischen durchdringt, möglicherweise eine ganz neue Ordnung oder auch Unordnung auferlegt, die mit jeder traditionellen Vorstellung von Ordnung und Gewissheit auch brechen kann. Vor allem stellt sie die bisher regionale oder lokale Definition von Ordnung in Frage und stellt die Frage der Ordnung sozusagen global auf die Tagesordnung. Also sind wir am Ende womöglich nur noch Datenträger, deren Handeln und Trachten grenzenlos überwacht, ausgewertet und vielleicht auch wirtschaftlich ausgebeutet wird? Oder gibt es bei den Debatten über künstliche Intelligenz, die ich persönlich für total überzogen halte, weil Intelligenz etwas zutiefst Analoges ist, aber gibt es bei den Debatten über künstliche Intelligenz dann eben auch Algorithmen für Empathie, Solidarität und Gerechtigkeit? Ich habe noch keinen solidarisch handelnden Computer erlebt, jedenfalls mir gegenüber hat sich kein Computer bisher so verhalten. Und es haben sich auch nicht Computer, die bei mir im Büro stehen, ineinander verliebt oder Trauer gezeigt oder dergleichen mehr, was alles zur Intelligenz gehört. Vielleicht sollten wir ein bisschen runterfahren und lieber weiterhin von maschinellem Lernen reden. Vielleicht blüht uns andernfalls eine Maschinenstürmerei. In 20, 30 Jahren werden wir vielleicht einst wie die schlesischen Weber die Computer aus dem Fenster werfen und zerschlagen, weil wir am Ende doch in einem analogen Miteinander unsere Dinge regeln wollen. Wir werden das sehen. Auf jeden Fall geht es heute auch um alternative Konzepte für diese jetzt eben aus Spaß ein bisschen zugespitzten Optionen, zumal vielleicht gerade in den Städten, in dichten Ballungsräumen, die sich der Digitalisierung gar nicht widersetzen, sondern ein neues, demokratisches, aufgeklärtes Ordnungs- und Regelsystem darüberlegen. Vielleicht gelingt uns ja auch das. Und das wäre dann so, dass unsere Zukunft durch das Digitale auf neue Weise analog werden würde. Das ist etwas, was ich mir jedenfalls wünsche. Jetzt aber wünsche ich uns Vergnügen, aber eben auch Erkenntnis und Nachdenklichkeit im Fortgang der Dinge und darf Ihnen die Moderation übergeben. Vielen Dank.
Dankeschön. Thank you. And this is where we switch to English. Also from my side, warm welcome to everyone to this evening on digital municipalism, radical democracy, and the social future of technology. My name is ROMY KRÄMER, and I know that some of you might have expected Ezra Küçük here today. Some very big footsteps to step into, I guess, in moderating the Berliner Korrespondenzen. My name is ROMY KRÄMER. I'm the managing director of a small private foundation, not of a big Allianz Kulturstiftung. And we fund activists and social movements across Europe. And this is also my relationship to the topic. We have funded the conference of the radical municipalists called Fearless Cities in 2017 in Barcelona. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. Before the digital transformation, information was power. But today, data is power. And this power currently lies in the hands of only a handful multinational tech conglomerates that reach into nearly all aspects of the lives of everyone connected to the internet. I think all of us here have at least some sense of there being a risk in this concentration of data and power and the all-pervasiveness of these technologies. Even the Financial Times, a place where I would usually not look for critical information on business, now sports headlines like, "Our personal data needs protecting from big tech," arguing for higher regulation of data-hungry tech companies. On the other hand, however, we might prefer not to go too deep into questioning the status quo. In the end, isn't it all just too convenient? Does it really matter whether some faraway company collects my data? I don't have anything to hide, do I? And isn't it all this technology also good for something? Can't it help with democracy and the provision of better services to citizens? When aggregated to the city or national level, these questions take on a bigger meaning and touch all of us at an existential level. Finding good answers will determine whether our future is one of neoliberal exploitation, singularity, and control under the dictatorship of efficiency, or a future of fairness, pluralism, and sustainability in a democracy that actually is worthy of the name. It seems to be that cities like Barcelona and Amsterdam are going to be the places from where the resistance to that first doomsday scenario emerges. These so-called rebel cities are deeply affected by issues such as mass tourism and the financialization of housing. And they have realized that the free services of big tech companies often come at a high price, the loss of sovereignty. There are a number of efforts underway of cities around the world trying to regain this sovereignty and to loosen the grip of Silicon Valley giants over their citizens and their data. Moscow has pledged to completely drop Microsoft products from the city's systems. Barcelona and Amsterdam are experimenting with putting data back into the hands of their citizens and change their procurement guidelines. We have two leading thinkers here tonight who are trying to grapple with the moral, political, and social consequences of digitalization. I very much look forward to debate and jointly think about radical democracy and the social future of technology with Evgeny Morozov and Lorena Jaume-Palasí, and with all of you. If you haven't been here before, the flow of the evening will be as follows. First, Evgeny is going to give a 15-minute statement. Then Lorena is going to reply. Then we're going to have about 30 minutes of moderated debate between the two of them. And then we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience. So take note if you have any questions that come up during the discussion. Let me briefly introduce both of our guests. Evgeny Morozov is a writer and essayist. He's the author of The Net Delusion and To Save Everything, Click Here. His new book, titled Freedom as a Service, The New Digital Feudalism and the Future of the City, will be published next year. He's a syndicated columnist, with his monthly column appearing in The Guardian, The Observer, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, El País, and others. He has also written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, Financial Times, and The Wall Street Journal. Previously a fellow of Georgetown and Stanford Universities, Evgeny is one of the most brilliant and prolific critics of digital capitalism and big tech companies. He recently launched The Syllabus, that helps users to salvage the best, deepest, and most important bits of information from the ever-growing pile of information generated today. Lorena Jaume-Palasí, is the founder of the Ethical Tech Society and AlgorithmWatch. She works and researches at the interface between IT, law, and ethics, trying to tackle the challenges that emerge from digitalization and automation. She has co-edited and published several publications on internet governance and privacy. She also is an advisor who has, among others, been on the Council for the Spanish government, the European Parliament, and the European Commission on data politics and AI. She's one of 100 experts on automation and ethics at the Kotek Foundation and also a fellow of the Bucerius Foundation. You're surely very busy. And we're very happy to have both of you here tonight, and I would like to welcome you on stage to give your opening statements.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back, actually. I have not a lot of time, so I will launch right into it, and I suspect I might need to bargain for 3 extra minutes, if that would be okay. So I have good news and bad news. The good news is that municipalism, which I define as a political form that prioritizes the local, the democratic, and the horizontal, is more politically relevant than ever. As we live through a continued assault on public and collective forms of non-market social organization, it's to the city that we have to look to defend and perhaps also reinvent a democratic form of association and living and working together. The bad news, however, is that cities, even those led by inspiring and radical movements, have reached the limits of what they can do against their powerful adversaries. The rebellions of the so-called rebel cities have so far been rather quiet and ineffective affairs. Only a concerted effort, not just at the municipal, but also at the national and European level, can ensure that the radical municipalism has some teeth against the evil troika of big tech, big money, and big state. I'll tell you more about the machinations of this troika later on. So in short, this is the thesis of my talk today. Cities are more important than ever, but we should not let that lead us to complacency. Cities cannot and will not rule the world, at least not on their own. Technologies can help somewhat, but to focus on grassroots technologies of, say, deliberation or administration, when the core infrastructures of urban but also non-urban economies and cooperation are being handed over to the big tech and big money, is a mistake. So there will be three aspects to my talk today. First, an ideological and philosophical one. Second, an empirical and economic one. And third, and finally, a political and a policy-oriented one. So let's get to the ideological one first. Cities, I would argue, like any social structures and institutions these days, find themselves tempted by the neoliberal paradigm. I have a very unconventional definition of what it actually is. By neoliberalism, I mean efforts to prevent any non-market forms of social coordination from scaling up, and thus threatening opportunities for capitalist accumulation. Thus, neoliberalism has no problem making tactical allies and alliances with non-neoliberal institutions and ideologies, from the family to the church and from right-wing populists to even mild social democracy, as long as these alliances reduce the odds that some other non-market form of organizing economic and social activity would emerge triumphant and would consolidate this non-market efforts at social coordination. The most consequential of such alliances throughout the last 100 years was perhaps that between the ideology of neoliberalism and that of mass consumption. This coupling has given us this odd couple of the consumer/entrepreneur, which is the real cornerstone of neoliberal thinking. This couple is presumed to work in symbiosis to generate knowledge, and through knowledge to generate social progress. How does that happen? Well, entrepreneurs have to court consumers and compete with each other. This competition, the neoliberal thinking goes, ensures that they are always on the lookout for the cheapest methods of production, which pushes them to innovate. The consumers, on the other hand, have fluid, ever-changing needs, and they're always on the lookout for cheapest products. Thus, they too push the whole system to innovate, because they express new demands that must be met by the markets. The creation and generation of knowledge, thus, lies at the very heart of the neoliberal project. Knowledge for neoliberals means progress, and any scheme that does not fully utilize the knowledge of its moving parts is a scheme that will end in disaster. In the neoliberal imagination, the free market system has traditionally been juxtaposed to that of centrally planned economies. Now, however, that the Cold War is over, we still continue sticking to the same conceptual scheme that presumes that the only way forward is by building more markets and by turning citizens into consumers. Why? Because that's the only, and it's only in their capacity of knowledge-producing consumers that they're most useful to social progress and advancement. Now, this schema, of course, is completely wrong and broken, and we should have discarded it the moment the Cold War ended, if not earlier. There are absolutely no solid grounds to believe that when we act in our other non-consumer identities, those, for example, of citizens or neighbors or parents or friends, we are somehow committing crimes against knowledge. The success of social coordination that is not based on price signals and market mechanisms, that is exhibited by projects, for example, like Wikipedia or free and open source software, where participants produce viable and valuable knowledge for motivations that have nothing to do with competition or cutting costs, is a sure indication and a testament that, given the right infrastructures for collaboration and social coordination, a lot of vibrant, valuable projects can actually emerge. Granted, such infrastructures would not be enough without a shared mission and a sense of purpose, which both Wikipedia and free software have. Short of dictating such missions from above, kind of Soviet style, we would, of course, be better off letting people who already have shared concerns and aspirations to gain access to such infrastructures in an unconditional, unmediated way, very much like we have allowed them to access basic services such as healthcare and education under the previous paradigm of the welfare state. It's not thus at the national, but rather at the local level, in neighborhoods, streets, parks, and so forth, that such shared concerns and aspirations usually emerge. Here, I'm not talking about some kind of big society agenda of compassionate conservatism that the likes of David Cameron, for example, have tried to foster and impose on their populations, mostly to justify austerity cuts by encouraging people to solve their own problems, bypassing any formal state institutions. Rather, I'm talking about using all of those institutions to truly empower citizens, but in a way that would not only generate as much knowledge as the capitalist and neoliberal alternative, but might actually do so without having many of its side effects on the economy, on democracy, and on climate above all. At its best, this digital municipalism will help us imagine and implement new sorts of institutions for living together, complementing the already existing institutional landscape of the welfare state with more horizontal, decentralized, and local alternatives. To achieve all of this, of course, we first need to know why we want all these institutions in the first place, especially when market-based solutions are available. Could and should we really demand a right for our non-consumer identities to be recognized and protected? Couldn't we just trust the market and expect everything, freedom, solidarity, prosperity, to be offered as a service, the way mobility or security are already offered? I'm asking this question in part to convince you that digital municipalism, to be truly convincing, cannot dispense dealing with highly political and even ideological questions. But I'm also raising it as I'm moving into the second part of my talk, which tackles the obstacles, many of them having to do with the state of global capitalism at the moment, in the path of achieving this quasi-utopian municipalist vision. So what are some of these obstacles? First of all, we have to understand that cities have become a preying ground for that evil troika of big tech, big finance, and big state that I have already mentioned. The reason I call it a troika is because there is a fair degree of coordination between the three. Technology companies are deeply embedded into financial markets, with governments, and especially sovereign funds and pension funds, increasingly quite involved in them as well. Likewise, financial firms are increasingly invested in the recently privatized urban infrastructures, seeing them as a way to secure a stable flow of cash. Digital technologies, we call them smart rather than digital these days, are supposed to ensure that these infrastructures are run ever more efficiently. Governments, in their own turn, have a hard time containing the discontent of those who do not fit into the currently highly digitized and highly financialized economy. In the past, they have dealt with this problem by making credit widely available, so that in the absence of real gains in wealth, people can at least experience some fake gains as the value of the property skyrocket, for example. Then the governments moved on to presenting big tech as one industry that can, if not guarantee handsome returns to those who invest in it, then at least cut out living costs, make our environment cleaner, help us earn some money on the side, as with Uber or Airbnb, and so on. That was the government's playing the good cop. Now that this model of prosperity itself seems to be failing, the governments will increasingly play the bad cop, deploying the vast digital infrastructures of surveillance, policing, and control that has already conquered our cities, from surveillance cameras to drones, to tame the unruly populations that feel cheated. Thus, these three logics of technology, finance, and state power converge almost perfectly in the model of the smart city, where the nexus of big tech and big finance is to ensure prosperity and profitability, while the state is tasked with ensuring stability and security. For reasons which I long to explain in such a short lecture, I think that this prosperity and profitability part of this model is completely unsustainable. And the whole order of this system can only be maintained by increasing the sophistication of control exercised by governments. The first part of this proposition might seem surprising, and it's a pity we don't have much time to delve into it, the one about prosperity being fake. Suffice it to say, however, that the so-called prosperity offered and enabled by big tech, in the past decade at least, was just a product of them outsourcing and externalizing the cost of the operations on someone else. Their workforce, for example, precarious drivers for Uber and Deliveroo, their suppliers, for example, the Foxconn workers in China, their customers, for example, Facebook and Twitter users who have had their attention spans ruined forever, their neighbors, city residents, who couldn't afford to buy a flat and thus had to rent, experiencing all the horrors of rents going up due to the Airbnb effect, and even their funders. For example, venture capitalists, sovereign wealth funds, and big-name investors like SoftBank, which essentially have been covering up the huge losses in the range of billions, by the way, of companies like Uber and WeWork. But there were also bigger victims, I would argue. Democracy, due to the influx of fake news and manipulation, but also the climate, due to the energy consumption of data centers, but also due to immense inefficiencies of ride-sharing and electric scooters, which are in many respects inferior to public transportation. Now, only an optimist would think that our domination by the forces of big tech is finally coming to an end. The public debate we are having about them right now is not even about any of these matters. It's mostly about whether these companies abuse their market power to engage in anti-competitive practices. As important as this debate is, it doesn't question the sustainability, let alone the suitability of their businesses to a vibrant democratic system. As I've already said, I don't expect the big tech to go away anytime soon. Rather, what we are going to see would be governments and big-name players like SoftBank inventing ever more ways to keep the system going, perhaps with even more debt, while policing any explicit discontent against it. So this is more or less the background condition in which the so-called digital municipalism is to seek more radical democracy. As much as I respect the new social movements that have sprung up around municipalist projects and issues in places like Barcelona and Amsterdam, or Berlin for that matter, I must confess that I do not think that they are strong and strategic enough to take on this troika of big tech, big finance, and big state. Thus, a different set of tactics is required, especially if we agree that municipalism, informed by radical democracy, is the ultimate destination. But we have to embark on this journey in full knowledge of the fact that cities or municipalism should be the ends, not the means. Right? It could be the destination, and it should be the destination, but it cannot be the path of how we actually get there. What then is the appropriate means? Well, one can only fight fire with fire. The municipalist project needs a counterpart at the national but also the European level. These counterparts need to be committed to the agenda of radical democracy and be able to translate in pragmatic, policy-oriented agenda. 100 years ago, for example, the most progressive movements in Europe embarked upon the project of remunicipalization of essential services, from water to transportation and so forth, in an effort to build a welfare state that ensured rights and accessibility to all. It's a noble example to follow, but once we grasp the differences between the early 1900s and today, we will also see the limitations of that project. The digital infrastructures, while not entirely virtual, have a different geographic logic than, say, water pipes or tram lines. Cloud computing runs on data centers somewhere in California, so does much of artificial intelligence and anything else that is offered as a service. There is no simple solution to remunicipalizing them. Their ownership cannot just be switched from a local company to the city hall in a matter of minutes. It's possible, of course, to develop alternative local infrastructures. It might even be cheaper in the long term. But this will require a long-term and far-sighted national European strategy. It will also require quite some geopolitical finesse to ensure that neither American nor Chinese governments are too unhappy with European cities and states, hopefully, deciding to do it alone, building their own infrastructures. In the current moment, however, it will only aggravate the trade war. Granted, cities can start some pilots and prototypes, if only to show that all these alternative logics of non-market social coordination are not just a pipe dream. To some extent, this is what many of these exciting projects, including some like Decode in Barcelona, have been doing for quite some time and have been doing it quite successfully. But we should be under no illusion to think that some prototypes and good intentions will outweigh the collective machinations of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and the Pentagon. Those can be tackled only at the level of the nation state and better at the European Union. Ultimately, this is my concluding set of remarks, we have to remember that digital municipalism can also very well be non-democratic. City-states like Singapore, Dubai come to mind here. And there is no democratic municipalism that is also not digital, right? And this last part, I think, is worth emphasizing. There is no democratic municipalism that is also not digital. right? In the end, all the parts of the welfare state that we treasure, from health to education, will eventually migrate to digital infrastructure. It's not, however, a given that the rights associated with using them will do this migration as well. Not at least when such infrastructures are in private hands, and especially of American and Chinese corporations. This, I would argue, is the main reason why we should prioritize the struggles to reclaim and restore technological sovereignty over them. No other project of digital municipalism is as important as this one. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to a productive discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Lorena. Good thing that I didn't have a watch.
It's equally a pleasure to be here with you and start this conversation. We are in the era of a defeatist view of the world. Climate change, machine bias, neo-fascistic movements on the rise, threatening democracies in many countries. We hear stories about a world collapsing, and we hear those stories from very different political corners. We hear stories about a world in decadence. While one corner of the political spectrum talks about decadence in the same way that ancient Romans used to make use of this discourse to legitimate the claim for a strong leader, for a dictator. The other corner of the political spectrum is starting to do what Wallace Stevens once in a lecture at Stanford University in 1942 demanded. He demanded imagination. He said that it is one of the peculiarities of the imagination that it always is at the end of an era. What happens is that it is always attaching itself to a new reality and adhering to it. It is not that there is a new imagination, but that there is a new reality. Democratic imagination needs to be attached to a new reality. The realities it produced former times were necessary, but they are coming to its limits after leaving a few blind spots that have never ever been addressed, not even in its origins. Looking back in time, the history of democracy, it's a history of, from a philosophical perspective, mistaking ends with means, mistaking instruments with goals. Let me elaborate a bit on this. In the narrative of autocracies, the good city, the good life, was very much dependent on the moral citizen. So autocracies would demand the moral individual. And that meant politically that individuals first had obligations towards their cities, towards their societies. And derivated from those obligations, there were some rights distilled. Constitutionalism was a narrative that created a U-turn in the history of power legitimation. Constitutionalism offered a fairly different way of legitimating power. The power of the state was legitimated because the state would be a necessary monster that would first grant rights to all individuals, and derivated from those rights, some obligations would arise. That was the narrative birth of democracy. And that narrative birth had a second part of the sentence. The reason why this narrative was created, where citizens would be protected through the state and granted civil rights, was a very specific goal, which was actually not that far away from the goal of autocracies, which was living in cooperation and trust as a society. But that second part sort of went forgotten across the whole history of democratic narrative thinking and ideological productions. What happened is that suddenly we converted the legal instruments of granting civil rights, granting individual rights to each of all citizens in the society. We made it a goal. And that is the reason why democracies have a very individualistic approach. This is the reason why the ethics, the politics, but also the laws of our democracies are very individualistic. And in the course of history, as long as democracies were working on elaborating very sophisticated individual rights, fundamental rights, human rights that would protect individuals from the state and would balance the different rights between all individuals within society, it all was fine. But then came a point where there was no more work to do. And suddenly some cracks in the wall started to appear. And it is not a surprise that in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90 years of the 20th century, more and more philosophers, sociologists, constitutional lawyers started to make a criticism about the individual being the single unit of democracies. We would have Putnam declaring a decay in the social capital of the US since 1950s, and he elaborate this argument in his book Bowling Alone, where he would make the claim that citizens do not play with each other anymore. Social games would be played in a very individualistic, very privatized way. The same claims were made by Jürgen Habermas and his book on the structural transformation of the public sphere. He would claim that consumerism would produce a retreat of private individuals from the public sphere, which was practically the same argument that Richard Sennett was making at the other side of the pond. And even philosophers like the British philosopher Philippa Foot, that has been mentioned very much in the context of automation and autonomous cars driving. She made a massive criticism in the 1980s about how radical individualism in democracies had affected the methods of democracies. To her, democracies were trying to evaluate and regulate the woods by regulating single trees. And there was a good reason, a good historical reason why democracies would shy away at looking at the collective dimension of societies. There was historical experiences with socialism, communism, totalitarianisms that were offering a collective version of societies, collective values, and very specific ideas that democracies didn't want to touch. But the fact is that societies are more than the sum of its individuals, in the same way that the sea is more than the total amount of water that it has. So democracies never tried to address that part. They started thinking that that collective dimension could be simply addressed by legal normativisms and ethical normativisms that, as said, still treat the forest as something that can be analyzed through single analysis of its single elements. There's, additionally to that confusion, a few other more confusions, and there comes a bit of the controversy, to add a bit of a controversy here, to what Evgeny is saying. In the very beginnings of the 20th century, the engineering technologies were introduced in societies to orchestrate and organize them. The idea of the future in those days was very closely tied to technology as an instrument for changing historical contexts and to change societies. Elites, international elites, primarily coming from Europe and emigrating to both North America, South America, Africa, and Asia, started a technical discourse focused on scientific pragmatism and technocracy, with social engineering focused on the creation of neutral planification of big societal projects. I kid you not, this was not Silicon Valley, and I'm talking about the era between the 1920s and the 1950s. Hans Freyer, sociologist Franz Freyer, 1933, used to say, if the immanent utopia of technology is the transformability of all materials and forces into each other, then the immanent utopia of planning is the transformability of all historical situations into each other through technology. Karl Mannheim even declared the year 1935 the end of unplanned things. Planification and the technical expertise required would make a new form of politics. Technical experts postulated that by organizing society's infrastructure based on efficiency and rationality, or we've heard these arguments before, they could create societies for the sake of the common good that would overcome the subjectivity of politics. They even thought that they could make unpolitical politics, and that was the whole point. Using technology to do politics without having to address any political value and having to express any political value. This is precisely the conversation that we're having right now when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about digitization. Efficiency and rationality. This is something that resonates to all of us because it started here. It did not start in Silicon Valley. And many of the immigrants that then created Silicon Valley were not coming from any other continent than this one here. So we could see this as a sort of colonialistic project of colonialistic mother continent Europe. And again, engineering is a means, not an end. The constrictions of planification crystallized in public discussions in the 1970s. More and more, the value of public opinion make clear that infrastructure building was a deeply political act. Philosophers and sociologists like Foucault would address the power of infrastructure and how through standardization, majorities would produce violence to minorities, how through standardization, the overseen would dominate the unseen, how through quantification, societies would create asymmetries and would decide on things like the mobility of a country through the highways or access to social infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, and many other things. So in the 70s, suddenly technology was not neutral anymore, and infrastructure and the infrastructure that it created was not neutral anymore. And in the European continent, both in the Council of Europe and in the European Union, we started a conversation about what type of values do we need to guide this type of infrastructure creation. And we developed very rudimental ideas about that. Those were values about sustainability, and there were values about equality, and values about stability. It's very rudimental, but it treated this political act of creating infrastructure from a systemic view. It was seeing the woods from a more collective architectonical perspective, which is actually the open homework that democracies have been having for the last centuries. So suddenly, in the 80s, this conversation collapsed. The wall fell, and infrastructure politics became a thing that was less and less in the center of our politics. So the whole topos of technology being neutral was again in the center of all the conversation, and all the knowledge that we gather about asymmetries through standardization and about the political dimension of technology and infrastructure was forgotten. Today, planification in democracies is quite a complex act. It's hybrid. Governments are involved in the way how we create infrastructure, but the role of the state is focused not on the process of producing infrastructure, but on intervening and regulating the socioeconomic behavior of its producers, and on defining public infrastructure and the conditions of operation of said infrastructure, including the planification of geographical space for infrastructure. So yes, Silicon Valley resonated very much within this European continent because it's actually reproducing something that we already have been doing for many decades and just simply had forgotten. On the other side, paired to this infrastructural semantics, we had additional semantics, the semantics of growth, the semantics of innovation, and the semantics of progress. It was not knowledge, but those semantics that created a different market. Growth of what? Innovation for whom? Progress to? Market growth or well-being? Progress regarding technology development or progress regarding social equality? This very semantic has intensified this confusion between means and ends. So while national and city governments are focusing on the cities and still focusing on the means and less on the ends, a radical democracy will have to change that. A radical democracy will first need to address this collective value gap that we have created. It will first need to develop societal values. It would first need to develop collective methods to evaluate, analyze, and regulate things that are of a collective nature. And it can use technology in its infrastructural nature, because that's the point of digitization. We think of digitization in terms of service, but it's not a technology that really understands individuals, because it's a technology very much based on standardization, and with that based on creating averages and understanding majorities and collectives and on managing those collectives. It also has an infrastructural nature. So with that, what it means is that adding to the infrastructure, to the hard infrastructure of the electricity and the highways and the social infrastructure of schools and hospitals, we have a third layer of infrastructure here, the digital infrastructure, that might help us gap some of the challenges, the logistical challenges, the time and space challenges of our times. But we will only be able to address it and use it in a proper way if we understand that first we need to think more about society. And just to try to reframe this in one word, in one sentence, the future of democracy, if it is to survive, depends very much on its ability to become more than digitized individual mass societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. I think there's lots of material for discussion there, and I would love to start, I think, with the slight difference and emphasis that I felt from both of your talks, where Evgeny, on the one hand, kind of argued that, yes, the rebel cities are interesting experiments, but they're just kind of prototypes, and they can't scale up because we're lacking the higher level national/EU actions, and we need to radicalize our democracy at that level first so that we can then end up in the ends of having radical cities. Whereas you seem to be focusing a little bit more on kind of the value change that we need, and talked about utopia, and were a little bit more about the human aspects, and maybe that's also a bit of a divide that we generally have on the male and female side, where it's kind of like, don't we have to do this value work first before we think about kind of scaling this up? And I would love both of you to talk a little bit to that.
Well, I don't think that our perspectives are that much at odds with each other. It's only that I, for example, would extend the notion of infrastructure also to the idea of the market, and especially to the idea of the competition as a kind of central organizing device of modernity. In that sense, the reason why the conversation about the values inside infrastructure stopped in the 80s was because we have almost converged upon what we believed was the ideal way to organize society, and that ideal way to organize society was through the market. And in that sense, if we really want to start rethinking values, we really need to go back to the drawing board and rethink our commitment to the market and competition as the organizing devices of modernity, if you want to put it that way. And in that sense, I think we haven't done it, and it's long overdue, right? And that was also partly what I was trying to say with my talk, because if you look at the underlying rationale, how markets became this central infrastructures of how we organize society, even in the welfare sector, where now the expectation is that we have to introduce more competition, we have to introduce benchmarks, we have to introduce incentives. All of that stems from this idea of marketization. But underlying it is a very basic belief, which I think is wrong, which is that if we really want to advance socially, we need knowledge, and the only way to generate enough knowledge and to do it sufficiently is through the market, because the other option is to rely on the state, and the state in small doses will eventually lead us, will set us on the road to serve them, as Hayek would put it. So in that sense, I think we have to go and challenge that paradigm, because it already structures our society. And if we challenge that, then we can reopen the conversation about values, but also about alternative ways of generating that knowledge and generating progress. If we still want to stick to this modernist paradigm.
When you say
knowledge?
Yes.
Yeah,
what,
well,
what
I
does
define it in the
you?
talk very specifically. So if you read the neoliberal propaganda, so to say, for them, knowledge means discovery of new ways of organizing, for example, production, right? So you have two firms competing with each other. And one firm, in order to cut costs and undercut another firm, invents the automated conveyor belt system, for example, right? So they can, suddenly Uber invents self-driving cars, or Amazon starts using drone delivery, right? For people obsessed with economic growth, as you've put it, and competition, that counts as knowledge, because it's a new way of doing more with less, which is exactly what you define by the paradigm of efficiency. Now, we can, of course, accept it and say that, fine, that's the only way to go, and we have to accept and work within these parameters. Or you can say, well, that's not the only knowledge that matters, and there are other ways in which such similar knowledges are generated in society, and we have become almost, they have become almost invisible to us, and we need to go back and recover them. But this is more or less what is defined as knowledge in that paradigm. It's not my definition, that's sort of the definition with which we work.
Well, this is the definition that I would contest, I guess, because indeed, I think knowledge encompasses way more other things than just simply this economic idea or reframing, especially because indeed there's a lot of knowledge production that even though it would create more market advantages is being forgotten, because I just, from the historical perspective, I just don't see how knowledge has advanced markets. Quite the contrary. If you take a look at financial markets, hysteria is one of the things that has advanced very much the whole investment market. Sometimes reactions are not logical at all and not previsible. So I do think that there are many other components that are changing the equation of the economy, but not also the economy, the politics. I think that when we're talking about all things social, the factors that affect the reason why a market collapses or has success for a specific period of time has a lot of things to do with also the cultural acceptances, the cultural practices, the way how we produce and create markets here do not work in Thailand. They only work partially in very specific contexts when it comes to relationships between, I know, fabrics and industry within Europe and Thailand. But in Thailand, you see the way how people work in the market in a very different way. And I sort of, I do see that the idea of knowledge, it has a very problematic component of rationalism, of, so to say, of objectivism, in a way that it's sort of facts that are thrown into you and that leave no other way than to go that one way. And I see the problem in that type of concept. But I think that if we take a look at the semantics being used in the market right now, it's growth, it's innovation, it's things like progress, and prosperity, where you think, yeah, but define what it means. I think that that's rather the point, that we really do not have a very concrete value-laden idea of what is it that our society should have as a guiding principle for, because we concentrate so much in processes. And all these market processes are, I mean, take a look at the platforms. They are all about process. Google is about process, Facebook is about process, Amazon is about process, Airbnb is about process. The content, they're not producing it. It's being produced by all of us. And that's the interesting thing, that those platforms work because we can project very different contents, very different ideas, and with that it can resonate to many of us. But on the other side, when it comes to democracy, precisely is that lack of values, guiding values, that sort of make our regulation and all the ideas that we have to get a hold of what we have right now sort of senseless. Regulate tech, for what? What is the reason why we should regulate it? What is it that we want to protect? Regulate an algorithm, for what? We can regulate an algorithm and say, this is the way you should process something. But if you don't put a value at the very beginning, and this is one of the problems of our regulation right now. In law, we used to have this law dogmatisms, where we say one of the first principles would be that law is technology neutral. It doesn't look at technology. That's not the important part on the first layer, perhaps on the second or the third layer, or the third round, so to say. But on its very first layer, it looks at what is the social conflict and the potential harms in a society that we want to protect through regulation. And this is something that we don't know, actually. There's a lot of unproven scientifically unproven assumptions. We think that Cambridge Analytica changed the democratic elections in the US and in Kenya. Fact is, we don't know. Studies that we've seen show differently. We think that algorithms will manipulate us. We don't know. There are factors where they can manipulate us. There are other situations where we have proof that it did not manipulate us. So I think we first need, before regulation comes, we first need to think, what is it that we want? What is the democratic project? What is the democratic vision?
But so let me just jump in here. So, I mean, that is not going to happen, I think. There will not be, after, since 1960s until now, there will not be a coherent vision of society with a universal set of values that we'd like to defend. But
why?
Why? Well, because we all represent different ethnicities, genders, social groups, classes. I mean, the clash of society in 2019 is obvious to me. And the idea that we will converge upon a universal, some kind of, even within a national context, social vision, where everybody will kind of in a Habermasian way reason with each other and converge upon a universal value system, I think it's not coming this moment. But the adversaries that I have been trying to outline, I sound like a broken record already, the neoliberal camp, they have come up with the only effective solution to this dilemma. They have said, okay, all the narratives in a postmodern world are completely fragmented. There is no coherent story. We'll give you one, and that coherent story would be about putting the figure of the consumer and the figure of the entrepreneur on the pedestal. And we will celebrate them, and we will write all the laws with optimizing their kind of choices in mind. So why is the consumer the center of their analysis, because they think that in our identity as consumers, we're all alike, because we all want low prices. It doesn't matter that I am a woman or a man, or I am black or I am white. What matters is that in my identity as a consumer, all I want is a low price, so I can actually build a policy and enforce a set of laws that will guarantee that. And it's the same side, by the way, with the entrepreneur on the supply side, where I would like to create the conditions where the consumers will get lower prices. So in that sense, it's a value system I detest and contest. But I would argue that's the value system that currently holds us together. And if we really want to start kind of breaking out of that rather defective value set, we have to contest it, because this is what structures how we think about this company. So I agree, a lot of these companies are about the process, but they are also about justifying what they do by appealing to our identity as a consumer. They are free, almost free. They enhance our choices. They're there to help us choose and define ourselves in the marketplace, right? And this realization of our identity and subjectivity in the marketplace, I think, is the core proposition of the last 30 years of the neoliberal project. And we cannot just pretending that it does not exist. I think it's there, it's visible, it's palpable, and it almost kills and eliminates all the alternative political subjectivities that might pop up on the horizon.
I contest that. First, I think the enemies, as you would call them, we already have them here in our continent. 70% of the dual-use technology for digital identity that is being exported to Africa, to autocracies in Africa, does not come from China, does not come from US, it comes from the European Union. The Kenyan Digital Identity Program that is collecting biometrics of the Kenyan society and also the DNA and many other things. It's like a horror trip. It has everything from health records to financial records and so on, comes from France. And they are expanding all across the sub-Saharan Africa. So we do have this landscape as well here. It's not big tech, it's SMEs, but they have a very similar impact. And I think that that's the first thing. The second thing, apart from that, is that even those big tech companies, even those SMEs companies are providing processes with, of course, an economic intention. I refuse to think that individuals using those services feel and see themselves as consumers. There's a lot of communities in Iran, for instance. The LGBT community is flourishing because they suddenly have a space where they can meet, because in the analogous space, it's not possible. Civil society in Myanmar and Bangladesh was organizing themselves through internet, and the last chance, the last room they had was the digital room in Facebook. Really, in Facebook. And in many other communities, we see people like Nigadad that is creating this women support network through Facebook in Pakistan, helping women that are being attacked or are being abused both online and offline.
Can I give just one counterexample? So the people all ordering food from Uber Eats and Deliveroo in Berlin and taking electric scooters, what political subjectivity do you think they represent?
That's a different, I think that's
90% of people who use them. I mean, it's clearly that you'll find all sorts of other examples. Maybe somebody uses a scooter because they believe deeply in environmentalism. But I would argue that most of people using those services here in Western Europe represent just one paradigm.
But because things are more nuanced. It's not either black or white. You just have a whole palette. And you have people using the internet and using the digital services for very different reasons, because they also have very different identities within themselves. They have their professional identity, they have the family identity, they have the official identity, they have a private identity, they have an intimate identity and function in their lives, and according to that they use those systems differently. So I think that
dominant identity embedded by the platform provider, people providing capital, people writing the laws that talk to them in that identity. Is there a dominant one among them?
I don't think there's a dominant one, because it's dialectics. I would say it's dialectics. It's what Habermas would say. I mean, let's be honest, public opinion, it's out there, and it's a dynamic that we've seen and that is being created, and we're worried about and are contesting. But public opinion is the effect of private citizens discussing things publicly. And we do see that in Europe. We see that people do not only talk about economics, but they also talk about politics, they talk about discrimination, they talk about human rights. I've never seen so many newspapers talking about bias
But
and
again,
human
do you
rights
see
and
that-
precisely what you're
So
exposing.
what is your Habermasian reading of Uber? I'm just want to hear that. Like, so I get into an Uber car, I order it where I nap. Do you think I want to engage in a communicative encounter with
But
the driver?
Could we look at examples where, for example, like in Taiwan, where the government basically kind of designs experiments where they're like, okay, let's introduce a new technology in a certain area and let's watch it for 12 months and see what sociocultural effects it has, what are the discussions that are coming up from the community, and then let's let that flow into the lawmaking process. So could you use, for example, digital technology to kind of build this community or have this community that is involved in that experiment feedback?
But I mean, look, again, we have to understand what we'd like to discuss. So there are clearly many ways in which you can deploy, redesign existing technologies, including Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, whatever, you name it. All of that is possible. If we would like to have a discussion about ways in which we can adapt ourselves to the big tech dominance of the US and China and find some spaces of resistance and solidarity, we can have the discussion and we'll find a lot of examples.
But
If
does
you
it
would like to
necessarily
discuss about structurally transforming the big tech environment, making it more democratic, embedding democratic rights into the system, making sure that we can actually build an alternative models of social organization there, making sure that we can maybe build a very different property rights regime around data and infrastructures, that would require not an ethic and political economy of adaptation, but an ethic and a political economy of transformation. Right, so, and we have to decide which of those two we would like to emphasize. And I emphasize the latter, but you can also emphasize the former.
In any case, I think we need to first understand what's the purpose. I mean, transformation for the sake of transformation doesn't also make sense. I think.
Well, I defined what the problem was, right?
Yeah,
was
you
the
did.
dominance of the American and Chinese big tech. So
But
it's
would
not
we-
transformation because we'd like to
what do you
transform
mean with
things.
regulation? But how do you want to regulate them? What should be?
I didn't say I would like to regulate them. Did I say I would like to regulate them?
You said you
demanded
expect,
European
you
action.
expect
I'd like to
European.
get rid of
I mean,
them.
not
It's a very different
not you,
thing.
but the European Union. You made a clear demand
Yeah,
for.
but the European Union can do all sorts of things. It can start building and investing money into creating an alternative set of infrastructures with regards to cloud computing or artificial intelligence.
But don't
It
we then
can-
just end up creating a European surveillance technology 2.0 that is
Well,
like European made
If you don't
because we
define
operate on the
problem
same
properly,
logic?
you will. But I suggest we should define it properly so that we know why we're doing it. So we're not just building a European set of digital champions, but we're actually trying to solve problem X, Y, and Z, right? And you can define those problems as excessive surveillance. You can define them as use of data of European citizens by private actors, regardless of whether they're European, Chinese, or American. You can define what those problems are. If you define the problem very broadly and you say, I don't like Google and Baidu, I would like to have Deutsche Telekom running it, then yes, you'll end up exactly in that scenario.
And what is the role of civil society in defining those problems and getting the EU to act on that?
Well, civil society comes in different forms and shapes, right? So you clearly have parts of civil society that will continue with the agenda they've been advocating for a while, and some of them are having a lot of discussions this week in Berlin. Agenda of defending digital rights, which I would probably classify more under the adaptation bit rather than the transformation bit in my dichotomy. What we are lacking are institutions of civil society that would be able to articulate an agenda related to transformation. You know, what kinds of laws we need, what kinds of funding programs we need in order to withstand the assault of SoftBank, a very big Japanese firm funded by money from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, which in the absence of any action, will come and simply buy out all the European companies that do anything interesting in this space, which would also drain all of the brains and all of the kind of talent, and will deploy them to a very different set of purposes. Right? So we have to understand, again, what are we trying to build? And the problem is that it's not It's not just a question of civil society versus the state, right? It's a question of having a coherent political agenda that will also be able to tackle this problem at the geopolitical level. Because the moment you will present a challenge to American big tech or to the Chinese big tech, both Washington and Beijing are going to respond. And you will need to make a bet whether you would like to risk the dominance that Europe has in certain sectors, including selling cars, for the sake of regaining this European technological sovereignty, or they would like to risk it, but hope to build a more democratic digital society. And unfortunately, this is where we are lacking civil society activism, which will put pressure on European politicians to engage more geostrategically with these questions.
But what type of so if I understand you right, you would say the later thing, geostrategical agenda making would mean offering a sort of competitor to the level of US and China. Is it that what you're saying?
It depends if you'd like to compete with them.
What is it exactly where you it's just an option, or what would be another option?
Well, look, I mean, it's obvious, and I've talked about it in the talk, that virtually every sector of society, including parts of the welfare state, like education and health and transportation and whatnot, are increasingly reliant on a set of digital services, like cloud computing and artificial intelligence, to some extent, all provided by a handful of firms, none of which are European. Right? And that, to me, presents a problem. Because the data of European citizens ends up in China, it ends up in the United States. It has all sorts of secondary issues because, you know, essentially Europe, from a continent that used to produce things, becomes a big consumer market, which just pits China against America. For me, this is a problem, but there are many other problems on the horizon. Now, the question then becomes whether you would like to solve this problem by building a European champion of some kind and pit it against the likes of Alibaba or Amazon, or whether you would actually like to do something different and perhaps set up some kind of an effort where you will pour a lot of money into research, like we've done with space technologies, like we've done with nuclear physics technologies, with CERN and whatnot, which would be able to build a robust set of AI and cloud computing technologies and offer them to institutions in Europe that require them, right? Without necessarily going the whole as a service model of Alibaba or of, for that matter, Amazon, right? The way in which that will play out, it's no point articulating it because you have 27, 28, however we have at the moment, nation states inside the European Union. All of them will have different visions of how to implement it. So you can only articulate it in broad strokes and hope that something will happen. Now, that, of course, will not solve all of the issues. It will solve one issue, which is providing essential infrastructure for the functioning of what we used to call the European welfare state. On top of that, of course, you might need to build extra services. So you might need to create public funds of some kind that will fund the development of apps and services for citizens, so for citizen groups, or for associations, or for cities. Right? There are many things you can do, but the precondition to doing them is having some control over the underlying infrastructure. I just don't think that leaving that infrastructure in the American or Chinese hands will allow us to have the maneuvering space we need to build the kind of second-tier institutions on top of that infrastructure that we desire.
But ain't that replicating precisely what you are criticizing? That's a replication of the same market structure that is not eradicating and overcoming these type of structures, but just putting one of
We're just replicating infrastructures.
Oh, yeah, but that's a replication. It will not make a transformational change.
No, the citizens are supposed to make that change, not me.
Yeah, of course, but it's also about the methods.
Well, I let citizens access to infrastructure. Why do we have people access to education? Because you tell them what to do. There is no assignment after people graduate, unlike we had in the Soviet Union. You graduate from a college, publicly funded, and then you do whatever you want with your life.
Yeah,
so
but
you
we're
have
talking
access to AI, cloud computing, and some money to build whatever you want. It can be a startup, it can be an NGO, it can be something else. Why am I to dictate people what they should be doing?
No, because we're talking about what would need a radical democratical transformation theory. Yes. What would be the right process to foster that? So that's the why. And of course, if we talk about, we have this systemic problem of consumerization and marketization of things that should be more than just simply the market, but that have other dimensions, then just replicating by putting another offer in the market doesn't change that transformationally.
How is it replicating it? Just explain me.
just
What am I replicating?
You replicate
market logic.
the market logic.
What is market logic about cloud computing, artificial intelligence? It's a service, you know,
Well,
a bus. A bus is a bus. It gets you from point A to
yeah,
point
but that's
B.
precisely you are talking in terms of nationalistic thinking. It's China versus the U.S.
Well,
and
IDP
versus
News.
getting our regional, if not national, so to say, sovereignty. But the thing is, I guess that with that, we sort of still stuck in that type of logic, and when I think of change, I think that the thing that would bring us in a different position is by not playing the game, but just playing a different game. So for me, that would mean that just putting another offer is not enough. For me, radical change would mean that we really need to change the games of the rule. That one of bracket aside comment. I don't think that that infrastructure necessarily needs to rely solely in the hands of governments, or that the whole economic sustainment of infrastructure should be paid by the state. I think that one of the things that democracies did pretty well was the hybridization of infrastructure building. There are worst practices, there are best practices. I think there's a lot we can learn across all these last 60 to 70 years of infrastructure making, where we can see there are some cities that have very good infrastructure, there are others that have questionable infrastructure, but we see that private actors have a place in building infrastructure, in producing infrastructure, and in creating the dynamics of infrastructure. But the rules are different when it comes to offering infrastructural services. But I think still, the problem that we have is that people think very individualistic. We live in, I bought a school with my partner 8 years ago. It is in Brandenburg, which is in the outskirts of Berlin. It's in the rural side. And it was an empty school, no children, 700 people living there. And there, when someone wants change means they're moving to the city. Change does not mean changing the place where they live. We had a honorary major, and she had secured subventions from the European Union to reform an old farmhouse. It was an historical farmhouse, and the idea was to make a house for the community, because there was no community, and there still is no community there. And the people said no. It didn't cost them a thing. And they said no. And the young people just simply goes to Berlin or somewhere else when they are old enough to be able to leave the house. So I think that the problem lies there, that change in our democracies means individual change. That when we think of change, we don't think of democratic change. And if we think of democratic change, it's always my individual rights, my human rights. It's all about human rights and my. But there is no idea of what is this society and this collective of people I'm living with, and what is that we share together. E pluribus unum. There were a lot, and in the process of making our nation states, none of them were homogeneous, none of them. They either homogenize society in a brutal way, or they sort of cope with the fact that they have a heterogeneous society. And actually, I really like what Stevens has to say about imagination, because precisely constitutionalism, the imaginaries of thinking of a power that is not the authoritarian power of the medieval state times, but something else, happened just at the very end of the medieval ages. It happened at the end of a specific history time, of a power era. And the same goes for utopias. The same goes for I Had a Dream, Martin Luther King. The same goes for many other ideas. Actually, the fact that we start to believe in things that do not exist, like money, or in things that we cannot touch, like democracy, have to do with the fact that we believe in them, that we think that there is something in there that it's worth to fight for. So in the very end, if we're not able to produce ideas and visions of what is in our society that we all share together and that is worth fighting for, it doesn't matter how much regulation we create. It does not matter how different products we offer. We will still be lacking what we have been lacking for hundreds of years.
The
Social
opposite is also
cohesion.
true, sorry.
Social cohesion, it's about social
I accept
cohesion.
this very poetic vision, but you also have to accept the other side of it, which is that if you don't come up with that vision in the next 5 years, that's over. You have 5 years to make sure that the infrastructures of AI, cloud computing, and what have you, that Europe can still somehow remain within its reach. So I'm all for thinking big, I'm all for imagination, but you have to understand that there is a ticking clock, and that ticking clock is accelerating.
But that's precisely our work. That's your work as well.
Well, fantastic. And, if you think that I have a shortage of ideas, I can point you to quite a lot of articles I've written with quite a lot of imagination in them. That's not the point. The point is that you think there is a shortage of ideas in Berlin. I mean, go to any bar, you'll find a lot of them. The problem is not at the level of ideas. The problem that we have is at the level of how do you articulate a political vision and then act upon it that will actually at least show you what is it that you need to prioritize.
But that's the problem. Right now, there's 5,000 people in the Australia Hotel here in Berlin, and they're all discussing about human rights.
But also 5,000 tractors earlier.
Yeah, but yes, human rights, individual rights, consumer rights, everything at the individual level. There is no single session going beyond human rights. There's no single session, there's no single discussion in that conference with so many tracks discussing societal values. But if you don't have that, then there is you cannot create the proper regulation that you are going to need to address infrastructural points. And we do have...
Sorry, but isn't human rights a societal value? Sorry,
no,
now you really
not.
got me.
No.
Human rights, it's not?
No, it's not.
Human rights is the societal value recognized by society. That's why we'll talk about it.
No, it's not. Human rights are individual rights.
No, but as a value, it is a social value. That's why we keep talking about it.
It's not a social, it's an individual value. That's the one that I'm trying to make there. Pardon me?
Why do they all talk about it then?
Yes, because they are confusing individual rights with societal rights. Because they are confusing the fact that individual rights, what's a method to create social trust and cooperation with a goal in itself. That's an instrument to create trust and cooperation relations between citizens. But then there's a collective dimension that cannot be addressed by human rights. If you take a look at the social cohesion in a city, when you are planning how you are creating the streets, you will not come far with human rights.
Well, look, I'm not a defender of human rights. I'm just emphasizing. No, it's not, I'm on the record. I think that they've been overplayed in the last 15 years. I'm much more for socioeconomic ones. But what you are describing, I think, it's a false diagnosis. The diagnosis that we have certain social values. Those social values just happen to be the wrong ones. I don't know, why do we need to pretend that we all don't share anything in common and we all kind of celebrate things that, even individualism is a social value. It's a social value that society has collectively decided to recognize as important for its own survival and functionality. I mean, how is it not? And so are human rights and so are consumerism. You may not like them as social values, but they definitely are social values.
But could we accept that, for example, like in these radical cities, rebel cities, whatever you want to call them, where radical municipalists have taken over government and where they have kind of been able to install a different kind of utopia, where they have been able to inspire people, and that was not necessarily with digitalization, offering services, but literally by door-to-door mobilization, using also technology to not only have assemblies on the street, but also have people just debate and make decisions online. So could we say that if we depart from that level of the city, that we could start building up a different set of values that we then also have to spread? And I think the tractors that you mentioned are a really good point, because we have to spread that beyond the cities, and we have to create that connection and also use digital technology to connect back also to the rule.
But the point with city municipalism is that it leaves the rural areas outside. And I think that radical democracies in the digital era do not differentiate by geography and do not prioritize by geography. That's the first point. And if you want me to tell you a few examples of societal values, I would say sustainability is a societal value. Social cohesion is a societal value. And non-discrimination, it's not individual thing, it's a societal thing.
But what, you determine them objectively, normatively? That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Because clearly for a lot of people, that are now having this confidence, human rights isn't social value.
From the dogmatical, but from
but
the
then
dogmatical,
completely denies hegemony, Gramsci. I mean, it's like, to me, it's a version of society which is axiomatic.
Every constitutional lawyer would tell you, yes, from the law dogmatic perspective, those are individual rights.
I studied critical legal studies. I don't believe in legal dogmas.
Before we get into the details of constitutional law, I would love to open this.
Can I answer a question?
To the...
I didn't, about the rebel cities.
Sure.
So taking over a government at this point, at the city level, means taking over big four consulting firms, which none of these administrations have done. So when you think that you have been elected into office and you have taken over the administration, you haven't been, right? And that's the dystopia that you meet, which completely confronts and occasionally smashes your utopia. So in that sense, I think we have not fully grasped the way in which power, but also public administration has been privatized and outsourced, and how much actual political substance remains inside the administrations conquered and reconquered by those rebel cities.
So the space of decision-making power is shrinking because it has been privatized already. But the question would be, can they take that back? Or can they start taking that back via the democratic process? All right. Thank you so much. I would love to open to questions from the audience. And for that, I would need some more light to see actually whether there is anyone who has a question. Could I get some Saallicht? Die Dame hier vorne in der Mitte im schwarzen Pullover. Haben wir ein Mikrofon? Dankeschön.
Hi, thank you. That's a very interesting conversation, and I want to go away a little bit from the meta level and build on this point of imagination. And I would really like to hear your thoughts of how a city, a space would look like as a vision once we have departed from our challenges that we've been discussing so far. What are the features, really concrete? Do you have an idea? Since you spend a lot of time thinking about that, I'd really like to hear how that vision would look like in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. A positive vision of the city.
I think that a positive vision of the city would be not even the city. I would say it could be also a small town somewhere else. And I think it starts with units. It starts with units of communities. So it is a place where both, it doesn't matter. So it would be a place, or it would be a state where where living in the rural area or living in the city is not a question of obligation, but a choice, and it can be made by choice. It's a place where mobility is not based precisely on geography, but on necessity. It's a place where the distribution and the idea of fairness is based on what the society of that place thinks that fairness means, and that is able to include the differences. And it's a place where where there is both a space for for societal values such as sustainability, such as social cohesion, such as open processes that are also able to understand that individuals have a particular side to them. So it's not only about creating societies that have societal values, but sort of leave the individual in its particularities and originality outside, but also have those spaces where you can have that as well. But it also means that we have democracies that have that do not overweight the citizen with processes, but do also create mechanisms of governance that are able to produce knowledge to better understand, on the first place, what is it happening on a political level if they want, that they have a good governance process to redress if there is something that is going wrong on the one side, but at the other side, societies are not where transparency is not being used to transfer responsibility from the places where the power is to the places where the asymmetry lays, so to say. Yes, because right now our societies think too much about transparency, and this transparency is transferring a lot of responsibility in the very end to the citizens. And I think that responsibility of the citizens is to really think and create the imaginaries. The ethics, it's not in the government. Ethics is also not in the private sector. Ethics is it's within us. It's that what society is meant to produce and to express, and then it's meant to be enshrined in law to a specific point. So a place where this can happen, and this has been more and more fragmented and segmented because of this radical individualization of our lives, because of this separation and detachment. And right now we could do that more and more. And the utopia would be, indeed, create a space where that is possible. But that is very abstract. And in the end, it sort of depends really on the context. This Finland, it's a very different context than Berlin. In Berlin, we have a vibrant city with a lot of citizens and a specific demography. The demographics of somewhere in the countryside in Finland is a very different one. So the utopia would really be understanding those differences, including those differences, and still being able to express the commonalities.
So pluralism with commonalities.
Pluralistic societies, but with some sort of social cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a bit less a fan of social cohesion, as you might have inferred. In that, I don't think it resolves many even of the ethical questions inside, just how. So if you look at Chinese cities, forget about the fact that they're all top-down and run by the Central Communist Party. I mean, they're very socially coherent, and through social credit system, they'll become even more socially coherent. So in that sense, I understand that we can have a very democratic system of how we're going to inform those norms. But the idea that there has to be this quasi-abrasive layer on top of me, and now you'll accuse me of individualism, I know, it kind of terrifies me. In that sense, of course, I know that the standard response would be that you just need to have an opportunity to exit and move to the community next door. But I think it's kind of a cop-out. In that, I've been to quite a lot of villages where the norms that are being informed by social cohesion are quite terrifying for me. And I'm sure for quite a lot of other people, that's why they move out. It's not because they act individualistically or because somehow they are forced by some neoliberal ethos to abandon their communities, because they cannot stand it anymore. So in that sense, I think, there has to be an inherent internal critique of the social cohesion, which I fear the proliferation of data sensors and kind of algorithmically enforced mechanisms would not actually produce.
Pardon me?
No, I mean, I agree with much of what Lorena has said. So I just wanted to give that footnote about social cohesion. I mean, on the political end of things, I think the radical municipalism vision, which you'll find in Bookchin and others, I mean, it kind of gets things right. So there is no need for me to reinvent the wheel. The problem with that vision is not whether it's true or false as far as I stand. It's how do you create conditions of possibility so that this radical municipalism under the conditions of global capitalism is actually a realistic proposition. And the problem is that you cannot assume that those conditions of possibility will come into existence just because there is a bottom-up grassroots movement pushing for them, right? And that's, I think, kind of summarizes the entire message I've been trying to send throughout the entire evening, in that you can have good intentions, you can be perfectly, democratic movement, and yet fail, because ultimately you cannot expect a radical municipalist movement to be able to successfully challenge the logic of the likes of SoftBank or the Pentagon or Wall Street.
But this is exactly what is happening across whole history. Like the economic changes we've experienced from the ancient times until now are a result of questioning the way how we created economies and the way how economic trade was being produced and made. And it was not only that, it was also a questioning of the political asymmetries that lay within that. And it was also a question of societal changes, cultural changes, and also opportunities. And to be honest, yes, you're right, social cohesion has that danger. But the point is that if you don't have any type of value at the social level to offer to democratic societies, then you are living that agenda to totalitarianism, to fascism, and to everything else. And I'm sorry, but societies have different dimensions. They do have an individual dimension, but they also have a collective dimension. They also have a societal dimension. And democracy is not addressing it. And that's the reason why we are stuck, because the new technologies are collectivistic technologies. And we don't have the mechanisms at the regulatory level to cope with them. So we better start thinking, what mechanisms do we need as a democracy, contrary to China and contrary to Saudi Arabia and so on, that are democratic but are addressing at a collective level what is happening?
Let's take another question from the audience. Yes, pink, I think it is, red shirt.
Hey, I like the point you made about, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I like the point you made about knowledge and innovation coming mostly nowadays from private sector, where it's driven by competition and making better products, which means we might be missing out on other ways of innovating and gathering knowledge. I think there's been an interesting trend in the field of AI, actually, in the last 10 years or so, where most of the innovation comes from big research centers, which are owned or funded by private companies, but aim for academic prestige rather than product development. I'm thinking of like DeepMind, OpenAI, or the Allen Institute. Do you think there's value in those kind of centers, or are they still biased because they're owned by private companies?
Should we take more questions or respond one by one?
And then, okay, second question to the front. Here.
Hello. So you were speaking, both of you, a little bit about understandings of democracy or confusions with democracy, but also about political subjectivities. So I was wondering, what is your take? To which extent did digitalization or digitization lead to new development or the change of citizenship norms? And when I speak of citizenship norms, I don't think about citizenship in the sense of having a passport, but rather about citizenship norms as shared understandings of what constitutes a good citizen. And Mr. Morozov was speaking about citizen consumer, citizen entrepreneur, but I think that's rather top-down perspective on citizens. And I'm wondering, what do you think, how did this vision of a good citizen or shared expectation of what constitutes the role of a citizen in a society change from the perspective of citizens in the context of digitalization?
Okay, thank you. So data centers, maybe you want to answer that? Privately funded?
It's not so much data centers as private research institutes. I mean, look, I'm sure they will produce a lot of peer-reviewed papers that will be published in prestigious journals that in some sense constitute valid scientific research the way we define it now. So when you ask whether it will generate any value, I mean, my immediate question to you was value for whom? I mean, they'll generate some value for scientists, they'll generate some value for, the institutions in terms of prestige. Whether they will generate some kind of knowledge that can then be reappropriated, which was the initial intention, at least with OpenAI initiative, I doubt it, in part because their initial open nature no longer seems to be even open. They want to offer the services at a fee, and they kind of turned into non-commercial but still commercially inspired provider of AI research and services. In that sense, I mean, it's the overall question of how can science that's created under conditions of global capitalism be of use to a non-capitalist project. It's not specific to AI. It's a dilemma that we've had to struggle with, for a century, if not more. And I don't see that much changes in that question and set up just because we're dealing with digital technologies.
But don't you think there's a problem that scientific centers are not the ones having the most data anymore, but private entities?
But that's what he meant.
Yeah,
right?
but that's the truth. Why is not, that's a huge problem. If you do...
Yeah, but nobody said it's not a problem, right?
Yeah, but that's a change, because you said it hasn't changed.
Well, what hasn't changed is the fact that science produced under conditions of global capitalism still has problematic uses for a non-capitalist project. That hasn't changed, has it?
I do think it has, because now we have Amazon funding fundamental research from American universities. So
yeah, but what I'm saying is that it was problematic 100 years ago and it's still problematic. We can, of course, argue whether it's more problematic now than it was 100 years ago. And I would say, of course, it is, because science, like everything else, became much more privatized. But it's not a problem that appeared on our radar in 2010. It appeared on our radar in 1900s.
Okay. Sorry. And also sorry for the last question. I think we have to close. We're way over time. Thank you very much for your contributions and for the interesting discussion. I think we could have easily done an hour more. And thanks to you for your attention and for your questions, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Berliner Korrespondenz, ja. Am 11. Dezember haben wir die nächste Berliner Korrespondenz, die anschließt an dieses Thema. In der Cloud aus dem Sinn ist der Titel, und wir beschäftigen uns da mit der ökologischen Aspekten der Digitalisierung und haben da auch zwei spannende Gäste da, und zwar den Künstler und Autor James Bridle und die Klimapolitologin und vielleicht auch etwas Aktivistin Maya Göpel, die die Bundesregierung in Umweltfragen berät. Das heißt, wir werden mit der Digitalisierung weitermachen, ein bisschen noch den Themenaspekt Ökologie mit reinbringen. Das heißt, bleiben Sie uns treu, kommen Sie am 11.12. wieder vorbei. Und wenn Sie dazwischen nachlesen wollen, was wir alles an Berliner Korrespondenzen schon in der Vergangenheit gemacht haben, haben Sie jetzt im Foyer die Publikation, die gerade noch druckfrisch da ist, müsste noch ganz heiß sein. Von daher viel Spaß beim Lesen. Vielen Dank.